Hey boys and girls, this is Miss Masters from Scott Elementary. I teach kindergarten at Scott, and one of my most favorite things in the world to do is to read. I read all summer. I read a book every night before I go to bed, and one of my most favorite things to do is to read to my kindergarten kids at school. This is my little dog Ash, and she likes to listen to stories too. This is a book that my kids really like, and we've even done a skit on this at our bedtime stories at Scott to kick off our 360-minute program, and it's called Rabbit Stew. This is by Donna Casal, and it's illustrated by Tamara Petrosino. And here it goes. Once, a while back, in a rickety old shack, there lived a dog. He wasn't very smart. He didn't have much money, but he was very happy. The dog had a garden laid out in neat rows, nestled in a sunny meadow. In the spring, the dog planted seeds in his garden. In the summer, he cared for the plants and he watched them grow. Then he would pick and eat the vegetables that he'd grown. The dog loved his garden. But he had one big problem. Hungry rabbits would sneak into his garden and nibble on his vegetables. They made holes in his cabbage leaves. They dug up his carrots and potatoes, and they chewed on his parsley. The dog tried chasing the rabbits away, but they always came back. Pesky rabbits. Then one day, the dog looked out his window and saw those rabbits eating all his tender new lettuce plants. That was the last straw. The dog ran into the garden and he chased the rabbits around and around until he caught them at last with a leap and a pounce. Thought the dog. Now what should I do with these pesky rabbits? Maybe I'll make rabbit stew. Yes, I think that's what I'll do. So the dog took the rabbits inside and he put them in a large cooking pot. Then he opened up his cookbook, but he couldn't find a recipe for rabbit stew, and he didn't know what to do. He's scratching his head. One clever rabbit said, "You could go out into the garden and get some carrots to put in the stew." Good idea, thought the dog. So he said to the little rabbits, "You wait right here while I go out into the garden to get some carrots." And all the little rabbits just nodded their heads and they said, oh yes, we will try our best." But as soon as the dog went out to the garden, the rabbits leaped from the pot and they scampered happily out the door. When the dog returned, he saw that all the rabbits were gone. He dropped the carrots into the pot, feeling a little bit disappointed. Smart rabbits. The next day, when the dog looked out his window, the rabbits were nibbling on his onions. So the dog chased them around and around until he caught them at last with a leap and a pounce. Then he took those rabbits back inside and he put them back into the large cooking pot. "Now," said the dog, "I have rabbits and carrots to make rabbit stew." Then one little rabbit said, "But you must have celery for rabbit stew." "You sure?" said the dog. "I'll go out to the garden to get some celery, but this time you have to remember to stay in the pot, okay?" The little rabbits all nodded their head yes and said, oh yes, we will try our best." But as soon as the dog went out to the garden, all the rabbits scampered happily out the door. When the dog came back, he saw that the rabbits were gone again. As he put the celery in the pot, he thought to himself, "Those rabbits aren't very smart. They forgot to stay in the pot again." Pretty smart rabbits. The next day, the hungry rabbits sneaked into the garden again. So the dog chased them around and around until he caught them at last with a leap and a pounce. So he put those rabbits back into the large cooking pot. "I have rabbits and carrots and celery," said the dog. "Now I can make rabbit stew." "But you must have potatoes and onions to make rabbit stew," said one very clever rabbit. "Yes, I know," said the dog, trying to look very smart. "But if I go back out into the garden, you rabbits will forget to stay in the pot." After thinking a bit, one rabbit said, "You could shut the door, and then we couldn't run out that way." "Good idea," thought the dog. Then he said to the rabbits, "Now you stay in the pot while I go dig up some potatoes and onions." The rabbits all nodded their heads and they said, oh yes, we will try our best." Those silly rabbits. Out to the garden the dog went, closing the door behind him. And as soon as he was gone, the rabbits leaped to the window and they jumped out. Then away they ran, glad that they had fooled that dog again. When the dog came back, he saw that the rabbits were gone. He put the potatoes and onions in the pot, and to his surprise, that pot was full up to the top with vegetables. There was no room for rabbits. "It's just as well that the rabbits are gone," said the dog, "because they wouldn't fit in the pot anyway." He felt very proud for having such a great idea. Happily, the dog poured some water into the pot. He turned on the stove and he cooked his rabbit stew. It smelled delicious. For supper, he ate 3 big bowls of stew. Then, when he couldn't eat another bite, the dog put some of the leftover stew outside for the rabbits. "After all," he said to himself, "those rabbits might not be very smart, but they sure do know how to make a good rabbit stew." And that's the end. Good night, everybody.